This is the 21st Sunday of Pentecost, but I am observing it as the 7th Sunday in the season of creation, which is an interdenominational liturgical season. Even if you never saw it, you know that the movie Groundhog Day is a cultural icon because it's referenced humorously everywhere. It's Bill Murray inexplicably waking up over and over and over and over again on Groundhog Day, living through the day exactly the same way until he finally gets it right. I feel like that sometimes when I wake up and I look at the lectionary readings for the coming Sunday. In fact, I may have even made that joke before. Because of the story from Mark, there's also a version of it in Matthew and Luke. The lectionary has it over and over and over again, and I probably preached on this story 30 times. Now, the upside of this wash cycle is that I get to go back and look at how my perspective has changed, which it did. I'm happy to report there actually has been an evolution. Now, when I was a young man, someone would say an angry young man, and serving as an assistant, I loved preaching on this text because I was so full of righteous indignation. Looking back, I can imagine that my rector was grimacing for the complaints that he would receive as I held forth on the platforms of my youth. When I became a rector, I began to dread preaching on such texts because I knew it had a cost, sometimes personal, sometimes institutional, sometimes both. When I became seasoned and wise, I figured out how to avoid these texts when at all possible, or at least to be a bit strategic. Now I listen for what I missed before, and I listen to what I heard before, and I also know that preaching is a relationship, and what you do with it is at least as important as what I do with it. But the best thing about a text like this is that it places before us a food that we probably would never eat for ourselves, a food that is good for us. And it's almost no one brave enough to serve us a food like this except the Bible. So I'm going to jump into the text, and because you may have been around a few of these cycles too, you may have already considered something like this, and maybe you can look back and consider your evolution with this text. This is one of those stories where it's utterly clear that Jesus has a class bias. Not that he ever disguised it very well, but there are some stories and events where his class bias is very clear, and as a result, you and I recognize that we were not the intended audience of this story. In fact, in stories such as these, we are more likely the foil. Frankly, if I can get on my soapbox for a minute, one of the things that just irritates the heck out of me about North American Christianity is how utterly blinded we are to our place in this story. We are who we are, of course, all of us accidents of birth, but let's get real about who we are in these Jesus stories. When we hear these Jesus stories, we imagine that we are the disciples who Jesus is speaking to. We could also identify with the crowd Jesus is preaching to. And it's easy to commiserate with the leper or the blind guy or the woman getting stoned or some other poor miscreant coming to Jesus for help. And if we're forced to, we might even get pushed into imagining that we're part of the obnoxious crowd cheering for Jesus on Palm Sunday, then demanding his death on Good Friday. If you have been around in the church much, you have been taught not to identify with Jesus at all, except perhaps to feel compassion for him on the cross. Now, God doesn't actually appear in any of these stories, so even if we were megalomaniac enough to see ourselves as God, God only makes behind-the-scenes appearances as a voice or an angel or supernatural fireworks that are never quite explained. So who are we in these Jesus stories? We're not God, we're not Jesus, we're not the disciples, we're not the crowds, we're not the nameless poor begging for health or food, we're not the Judeans clamoring for a liberator, we're not the temple clergy snarling at the upstart rabbi. Rather, we're the scenery. And we shape the story in every act, even though we're never recognized or observed, because we exist between the lines of the story. We are the Romans. You and I are the Romans. We're not Caesar or the Senate, but the ordinary Roman citizens far away from the margins of the empire, who nonetheless benefit daily from the resources stolen and imported from faraway places and from cheap labor that keeps our goods and services less expensive. We're the Romans. In the Jesus story, you and I are Romans living well in our own country and often oblivious to the plight of Jesus and his disciples and millions of peasants at the margins of the empire. An empire more or less safely guarded by legions of soldiers to keep the homeland safe and secure. Even though that is our place in the story, you and I can benefit from listening in on the conversation between Jesus and his friends, so long as we remember that we are the outsiders. We're on the other side of the pane glass window with our noses smushed up to see a little better and trying to listen in on the conversation that does not include us and is not even directed to us. So why bother then? Well, because in remembering who we are, we also hear the wisdom and the hope that is present for us in these stories. You've heard me on this soapbox before, and you probably share my frustration with hearing so much Christian theology preached that does not even recognize that we're outsiders in this story. Our Christianity Americana thinks we are the favored friends and the companions of Jesus in this story. The irony is bitter. I could be fooling myself, but I think one of the valuable gifts of a place like this, and maybe like your community, is that we listen to these stories in order to hear what it has to say to us. And we try to recognize who we are and acknowledge both our brokenness and our culpabilities. Of course, we get defensive sometimes. We can get angry, hurt, and alienated sometimes too when challenged with a story like this one. I know that when I have to talk about such things, I feel kind of naked up here doing it because I'm a Roman too. But we don't listen to these stories to feel guilty. Feeling guilty is a useless waste of energy. Guilt is almost never a motivator for anything except resentment. When we talk about Jesus hosting an open table and we remember who we are in this story, then suddenly it dawns on us that even absentee Romans, even absentee Romans are invited to the feast at Jesus' table. So step back and think about that for a moment. Even imperialistic colonizers like us who live off the cheap labor of peasants so that we can have expensive wardrobes, nice cars, cheap electronics, and every kind of plastic boo-bob we've ever wanted, even we are welcome at the table. Now, the reason it is important for us to remember who we are in this story is that we can get kind of arrogant and self-satisfied about the openness of this table on which we celebrate Eucharist. Being so liberal and properly open, we can imagine that we're the hosts and that we opened this table with our invitation. It's easy and quite natural for us to forget it isn't our table and we're not even the hosts. When we forget that, we take for granted our place at the table, and then we cop this kind of paternalistic attitude like, well, isn't it wonderful that we let all those people in here with us? The punchline of this story we need to remember is that, and the one that will remind us of who we are in the story, is Jesus' little throwaway line. With God, all things are possible. With God, all things are possible. Even oblivious Romans are welcome at the table. To really begin to understand the gospel, we simply must take into account the difference in perspective between Jesus and us, and between the gospel's first audiences and us. Even those of us who are poor by U.S. standards and who may be in hock up to our eyeballs and leveraged to the max, even we are still enormously wealthy and powerful as compared to those who live at the margins on this planet, especially who lived in the margins on Jesus's planet. So when we hear from Jesus in addition to judgment, what we hear from Jesus in addition to judgment is an acknowledgement of God's mercy and love, and a stern reminder to his own colleagues that class warfare is not an acceptable option. All are welcome at the table that Jesus hosts. All are welcome at Jesus' table, even us. You know, Jesus was willing to take considerable heat by eating with the likes of us. And he certainly risked our rejection. He certainly risked our rejection of him when telling stories like this when we heard them. But he takes all those risks in order to invite all of us to the table so that we might eat together. It's the only way. Eating together at the same table is the only way for things to ever change. So I think I am beginning finally, or maybe not finally, but I am beginning now to get an inkling of the genius of Jesus' invitation and his openness for all of us to be with him eating at the table. It is the only way that we will ever be transformed. I thank you for being here, and peace be with you.